All right, so get this. We're diving into this crazy case out in Boise, Idaho.
Boise, Idaho. Okay.
Yeah, back in 2011.
All right.
And it's really, I don't know, something about this one just kind of stuck with me. The Anatomy of Murder podcast did an episode on it.
Oh, okay.
That's our source material today.
Hmm.
And yeah, I don't know, it's just one of those stories that you hear and it just stays with you.
Well, it's got all the elements, right?
Right.
I mean, it's picture perfect family, shocking murder, tons of secrets, lies, betrayal.
Exactly. And I think what makes this deep dive so interesting is that we get to hear the survivor's perspective, which I don't think you get a lot of the time in true crime.
Right, exactly.
So the podcast introduces us to Ashley Bison. She's a mother of 5. She was married to Emtt Coran. He was a lawyer, super successful. You know, from the outside, they had it all. But then as you hear Ashley telling her story, you realize that things were not so perfect behind closed doors.
Right, and that's kind of where this whole deep dive starts, right? It
Yeah.
starts with her perspective.
Yeah.
She starts feeling this unease in their marriage. He's working these crazy long hours. He starts drinking again. And she just has this intuition, that something's just not right.
It's that gut feeling, right? It's like you can't really pinpoint what it is, but you know something's off.
Yeah.
And it's so relatable, because she wants to believe her husband, but there are just these red flags everywhere. So she tries to get some advice, right? She talks to a marriage therapist. She even reaches out to someone at her church. But ultimately, she feels like she's kind of on her own in this.
Yeah, and I think that's an important point you just brought up there. I mean, even if you have support systems around you, these types of situations can be so isolating.
Absolutely.
Because on the one hand, you're like, I love this person, but then there's this part of you that's like, something's not right.
Yeah.
You're just constantly questioning yourself. And then, do you remember that detail in the podcast where Ashley prays for an answer, like literally the morning of the murder?
Oh, yeah. I remember that. It almost gives me chills just thinking about it. It's like this weird premonition. But at the same time, it could also just be like this really desperate plea for clarity, right?
Right.
Because she's so lost in the situation. What do you think?
Yeah, I think it really speaks to how complex human intuition is. We often get these gut feelings that we just can't explain. And sometimes they're right on, and other times they're not. But I think in Ashley's case, it's safe to say that her intuition was definitely trying to tell her something.
Yeah. And unfortunately, all of those anxieties that she'd been having, they come true that very night. So she finally confronts Emmet about her suspicions, and his reaction is total denial. He turns it around on her, starts accusing her of being suspicious, distrustful.
Gaslighting, classic gaslighting. And don't forget, Emmett's a lawyer, right? So he is skilled with words. He knows how to use language to manipulate the situation and control the narrative.
Well, for sure.
So it makes it even harder for Ashley to trust her own instincts because he's so good at twisting things around.
Right. And she's already vulnerable. She has doubts because of things that have happened in her past. And now she's being told her feelings are invalid.
Exactly. And, it's important to remember that this emotional abuse can be just as damaging as physical abuse. I mean, it really wears down your self-worth. It makes it so hard to trust yourself.
Absolutely. And just when you think that maybe things are going to start to get resolved, he even agrees to go talk to this marriage counselor, a friend of theirs.
Right.
All of a sudden, he announces that he's going to run to Walgreens.
Right.
And she describes this like overwhelming dread that just washes over her when he leaves. It's like she knows.
Yeah.
She knows something terrible is about to happen.
Yeah.
And then just a little while later, right around 10 p.m., the police start getting these frantic 911 calls about a shooting in the Walgreens parking lot, of all places.
I know. I mean, did you hear Candy's 911 call on the podcast? It's just gut-wrenching.
Oh my gosh, yeah.
You can hear the panic in her voice, and it really just sets the scene. It's just chaos. It's confusion, and it's just, a stark reminder of the reality of gun violence.
Absolutely. So the first responders arrive at the scene, and there are 2 men down, both with gunshot wounds. One is Rob Hall, who we'll talk more about him later, and the other is Emmet. Sadly, Emmet is already dead.
And the police have no idea who the shooter is at this point, right?
Yeah.
Or what the motive could be.
Yeah, they think it's a random act of violence.
Right.
Which, as we're about to find out, is so far from the truth.
Yeah.
And meanwhile, back at home, Ashley's world is about to completely fall apart. Waking up to that knock at the door, the detectives telling her the news, I mean, it's every wife's worst nightmare.
And the way they described Emmett's injuries in the podcast? It wasn't just one gunshot. He was shot in the heart and then in the head. So clearly this wasn't some random act. There was rage. This was intentional. Somebody wanted him dead.
The brutality is it's just unimaginable. And for Ashley in that moment, it's not just the shock of losing her husband,
Right.
but it's also realizing that this one answer that she prayed for that morning, it's been answered in the most horrific way possible.
It's so much to process, right?
Yeah.
And then as the police start to investigate, they begin to piece together what happened that night. And it quickly becomes clear that this was not random at all. Turns out the victim and the shooter knew each other. In fact, they were connected through the woman that Emmet was having an affair with.
Hold on, so you're telling me the other woman is married to the shooter?
Yes.
Okay, this just got a whole lot more complicated.
It did. And that is where we will pick up in the next part of our deep dive.
Yeah.
We're going to unravel this whole web of relationships and try to figure out how a love triangle ended up in a deadly confrontation. So last time we were talking about how the victim and the shooter actually knew each other.
Yeah, they were connected through Emmett's affair.
Right, exactly. And as the investigation goes on, the police learn that the other woman, Candy Hall, was actually married to the shooter, Rob Hall.
It's like a crazy love triangle gone wrong.
It really is. And, as they're investigating, the police are trying to piece together all these relationships. So they interview Candy. And at first, she denies having any kind of romantic relationship with Emmet. Says they were just friends.
But I'm guessing that story doesn't hold up for too long.
Not really, no. The police find these emails in Rob's truck that pretty much make it clear that he knew about the whole thing.
Yeah.
And he was really suspicious of his wife and Emmet.
And in the podcast, they actually play these audio clips of Rob calling Candy while she's with Emmet. And you can just hear the jealousy and the anger in his voice.
Oh, wow.
It's like a ticking time bomb.
It really is. And then on top of that, they get the security footage from the Walgreens. And you see Rob showing up, and he looks like he's frantic, kind of searching for his wife, like a man on edge, maybe even looking for a confrontation.
Right, so we've got jealousy, betrayal, anger, all these intense emotions are bubbling up. And they all kind of come together in this Walgreens parking lot. But what really happened during those final moments?
Well, that's where things get a little fuzzy. We have to go based on what the only witness says, and that's Candy. And, as you might guess, her story changes over time. So it's hard to tell what's real and what's not.
So walk me through it. What did Candy tell the police when they first talked to her?
At first, she said that Emmet was the one who started it, that he confronted Rob, got at his face, even challenged him to a fight. She said she tried to get them to calm down, but she turned away, and that's when she heard the shots.
But she never actually saw who fired the gun.
No, she didn't. All she heard were the shots. She even described them as pop, 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 pop.
Okay.
And that little detail, it actually becomes a really important clue later on.
Why is that?
Because that sequence of shots doesn't really line up with Rob's claim that he was acting in self-defense. Think about it. If Emmet had shot first, like Rob said, shouldn't the sounds have been like pop, pause, pop, pop?
Oh, that's interesting.
It makes you wonder who was really the aggressor that night.
For sure. And then there's the forensic evidence. Doesn't that contradict Rob's story too?
It does. The forensics people find gunshot residue on Rob's hands.
Yeah.
And only on his hands. They also find his DNA on the trigger.
So even if there was some kind of struggle, like Rick said, it looks like he was the only one who actually fired the weapon.
Exactly. It really throws his whole self-defense claim into question. I mean, if Emmet had the gun first, shouldn't there be some gunshot residue on him too?
Right, yeah. You would think so. It seems like an easy case to solve at this point.
You'd think so, but then things take another turn. Remember that jailhouse informant? Well, he comes forward and says that Rob had actually been practicing how to give himself a gunshot wound, like to make it look like he was defending himself.
Whoa, are you serious? You mean he might have been planning this all along?
It's definitely possible.
Yeah.
It makes you think about how much planning went into it.
Right. So we've got different stories, motives that don't seem to add up, and evidence that points to Rob. But what about Ashley? I mean, while all this is going on, she's dealing with the emotional trauma of everything.
Absolutely. It's important to remember that Ashley's going through way more than just figuring out what happened to Emmet.
Right. She has to deal with the fact that he was unfaithful and then murdered, all while she's trying to grieve and be strong for her kids.
Exactly. And in the podcast, she talks about feeling inadequate, like she wasn't enough for Emmet. And that's such a common feeling for people in these kinds of situations. It just breaks your heart.
It's that feeling of what did I do wrong or why wasn't I good enough that can really get to you when you're already going through so much.
For sure. And for Ashley, it's even more complicated. She actually knew Candy.
Right.
And she talks in the podcast about going to Emmett's office and feeling like something wasn't right between them. So now she has to deal with that, what if I had trusted my gut feeling kind of thing on top of everything else.
That's so much to deal with. And then she has to go to the funeral and face everyone knowing that the other woman is out there.
I can't even imagine.
It must have been so difficult.
It really must have. And then, to make matters worse, Rob Hall is released on bail only a couple of weeks after the murder.
Wow, that's unbelievable.
So Ashley's constantly reminded that this isn't over yet.
Right. The legal system doesn't always work as fast as our emotions do.
Definitely not. And for Ashley, it wasn't just about seeing Rob punished. She also wanted to understand why he did it. In the podcast, she says she wanted to talk to him, to make him see how much his actions hurt her and her children. That's such a natural human desire, to understand and find some kind of closure. But unfortunately, in this case, she never got that chance.
Yeah, that's really sad. So then the trial starts about a year later, and Ashley makes the really tough decision to go. She wants to get some answers, even though it means having to relive everything.
It's a brave decision.
It really is. So what happens at the trial?
Well, it's a pretty emotional roller coaster. The prosecution presents their case, focusing on Rob's motive, the forensic evidence, and all the holes in his story.
It sounds like they had a pretty strong case.
They did. But then, a key witness takes the stand, Candy. She finally admits to the affair, but her description of the shooting changes a lot from what she originally told the police. She doesn't mention the specific pop, pop, pause, pop sounds anymore, which the prosecution was really relying on.
So it seems like she was trying to protect her husband, even after everything that happened.
It definitely looks that way, and the judge sees right through it. He actually tells the jury to ignore her testimony. He even calls her the least believable witness he's ever seen.
Oh, wow. That's pretty harsh. So how did that affect the case?
Well, it wasn't good for the defense. And you can feel the tension in the courtroom as Ashley's watching all this unfold. It's not just some random trial for her, She's connected to every piece of evidence, every word that's said.
I bet. It must have been so hard for her to sit there and listen to them talking about her husband's life and her life, too, in such a public way.
Absolutely. And after weeks of listening to everyone talk and argue, the jury finally comes back with a verdict. Guilty of second-degree murder.
Can you explain that for us? What exactly does second-degree murder mean?
Sure. Second-degree murder basically means that the killing was intentional, but it wasn't planned out beforehand. So the jury decided that Rob acted in a moment of rage or jealousy, but he didn't go there planning to kill Emmet.
Oh, okay. So it's still murder, but they're saying it wasn't premeditated.
Right. And that makes a difference in terms of sentencing.
So what was Rob's sentence?
He gets 30 years to life, meaning he could get out on parole after 30 years.
That's a long time, but it doesn't bring Emmet back or take away the pain.
True. And, just when you think this whole story couldn't get any crazier, there's another twist. Remember Candy? The other woman.
Yeah.
Well, guess what? She ends up getting convicted later on for stealing tons of money from one of her old employers.
Wow, really? So she's not just the other woman, she's also someone who's made a habit of hurting other people.
Yeah, it really makes you wonder about her role in all of this. Was she just a victim of circumstance, or was she manipulating everyone around her?
It makes you look at the whole story differently. But even with all the chaos and betrayal, there's Ashley rebuilding her life. She gets remarried, has more kids, and finds a way to turn her pain into something good.
That's what makes her story so inspiring. She could have let herself be consumed by anger and sadness, but instead, she uses her experience to help others.
And that's what we'll talk about in the final part of our deep dive. Ashley's journey of healing and how she's helping other people who have been through similar things. We've talked about all the twists and turns in this case, but for me, the most powerful part is actually Ashley's story. How she went from being a victim to a survivor, and now she's actually thriving.
Right, and it shows you just how resilient people can be.
Yeah.
Even after going through something so terrible, she was able to find meaning and purpose in her life. It's really inspiring.
Definitely. Something that really stuck with me from the podcast was when she talked about running into Candy Hall at a restaurant.
Oh, yeah, I remember that.
She was overwhelmed with this urge to just confront her, to let out all the anger and hurt, but she actually chose to just walk away.
That's such a powerful moment. It shows that real strength isn't always about, fighting back. Sometimes it's about choosing peace and recognizing that engaging with someone who's hurt you so much, it's not going to bring you the healing you need.
It's like realizing that your healing is your own journey. You can't control what other people do or say,
Exactly. And by walking away from that confrontation, she took back her power. She didn't let Candy control her emotions or her life anymore.
It's like taking care of yourself first. And it made me think about forgiveness. You know, Ashley talked about finding mercy for others and for herself. What are your thoughts on that?
Oh, forgiveness it's a tough one. It doesn't mean that what happened was okay or that you have to forget about the pain, but it's about letting go of that anger and resentment that can really weigh you down.
Yeah, holding on to that anger only hurts you in the end.
Right. And it's a process. It doesn't just happen overnight.
It's like constantly working on yourself. And Ashley's taken that idea even further, right? She's got this blog, The Moments We Stand, and she started a nonprofit called A Reason to Stand. Both of them are all about helping other people who've gone through trauma and infidelity.
It's amazing how she turned this horrible experience into something positive, helping other people. And her blog is so honest. She just lays it all out there. It gives other survivors a place to connect and realize they're not alone.
And A Reason to Stand is like even bigger. They have resources and workshops, a whole community for people who are trying to put their lives back together.
And what I think is so great about it is that it's not just about her story. She's giving other survivors a chance to share their stories too,
But giving them a voice.
Exactly. She's creating this platform for healing and empowering so many people. It's pretty remarkable.
It's a powerful reminder that even when things seem really dark, there's always a reason to keep going, to find your strength, to reach out for support, and to remember that you are not alone in this.
That's exactly what I hope people take away from this deep dive. Ashley's story is a testament to the fact that healing is possible, even after going through something so horrific.
It really is. And if you want to learn more about Ashley's work, you should definitely check out The Moments We Stand and A Reason to Stand. They're amazing resources for anyone who's been through something similar. It's really inspiring to see how much she's helping others.
It is.
Well, that wraps up our deep dive on this case. It's a tough one, but I think Ashley's story gives us all a bit of hope.
Yeah, it does. Thanks for having me on to discuss it. It's always good to unpack these cases and see what we can learn from them.
Absolutely. And to all our listeners out there, take care and keep those conversations going.